The first bullet wasn't a warning, it was a promise. It tore through the water barrel, a clean, sharp punch that sent a geyser of splinters and water into the dusty air. The second bullet wasn't a mistake. It was a message. It shattered the stained glass window of the little chapel, the one where Isidora Herrera's mother used to light a candle every single morning, praying for peace on a land that had never known it. Isidora dropped to her knees in the dirt, her hands flying to her head, not in prayer, but in pure instinct. The third gunshot was the final word. It ripped through the heavy wood of the ranch house gate, a sound like a giant cracking his knuckles, followed by the one thing her father truly feared: the thunder of hooves, and the high-pitched war cries of men who had absolutely nothing left to lose. They were close again, too close. This wasn't the first time the Lakota riders had come, but this time felt different. They weren't striking to kill. Not yet. They were striking to remind, to send a message without a single spoken word to the man inside the house, Don Alio Herrera, a message that said his days of stealing land and calling it an inheritance were running out. His time was up. From behind the jagged frame of the broken window, Isidora saw them. They were like ghosts from a story she'd been told her whole life to fear. Wild hair, black as a starless night, flying in the wind, faces painted in symbols of war and sorrow, feathers dancing on the ends of their braids, and rifles held in their arms not like tools, but like extensions of their own bodies. The wind whipped across the yard, carrying the smell of burning sage, horse sweat, and something else, something old and angry. She should have been afraid. Every part of her knew that. But what she felt instead was a deep, bone-aching exhaustion. A tiredness that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with being a pawn. A piece in a bloody game she never, ever chose to play. "Inside!" The voice was her brother's, Captain Rafael Herrera. His hand clamped around her wrist like a manacle, pulling her up from the dust. "Now! Isidora!" She stumbled through the doorway, her boots scraping on the stone threshold, just as another shot cracked through the air right where her head had been moments before. The bullet slammed into the adobe wall, sending a shower of fine red dust raining down on her hair. Inside the sprawling ranch house in his darkened office, her father waited. Don Alio didn't sit. He paced. He paced like a caged lion. A predator trapped in a prison of his own making. A half-empty glass of mezcal trembled on his massive oak desk, the amber liquid sloshing with every heavy footstep. His fine linen shirt was dark with sweat, clinging to his back. And on the wall behind him, a portrait of their grandfather stared down with cold, dead eyes. The first thief in their bloodline. The man who'd come to this land with a gun in one hand and a piece of paper in the other, and declared them both holy. "I told you we needed more rifles," Raphael spat, slamming the heavy wooden door behind them. The sound echoed through the house like a coffin lid closing. "We don't need more guns," Don Alio said, his voice dangerously cold. He stopped pacing and turned, his face a mask of controlled fury. "We need a treaty." Raphael let out a short, bitter laugh. "A treaty? You want to sign a piece of paper with people who paint death on their faces and call it prayer?" Isidora stood by the door, her wrist still throbbing from her brother's grip. She felt like a ghost in her own home. "They want us gone," she said, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the thick, tense air. "And maybe they're right." Her father's eyes flashed to her, hot and sharp. He opened his mouth, a furious retort ready on his tongue. But then he seemed to see something in her face, the exhaustion, the resignation, and he closed it again. Without another word, he turned back to his desk, picked up the trembling glass and drained it in one swallow. Outside, the gunfire had stopped. The war cries faded. Just as quickly as they had appeared, the Lakota riders retreated, melting back over the ridge into the bruised orange haze of the setting sun. It was over, for now. Another warning delivered. Another debt left unpaid. That night, a decision was made. It wasn't a conversation. It wasn't a debate. It came down on Isadora like a noose, slipped quietly around her throat while she slept, waiting for the dawn to pull it tight. The next morning, Colonel Esteban Vargas arrived. His polished boots left faint red dust prints on the imported Spanish tiles of the entryway. He didn't wait to be announced. He strode right into Don Alio's study as if he owned the place, which, in a way, he did. "Still standing, I see," he said, a dry, humorless smile twisting his lips as he pulled off his leather gloves, one finger at a time. "For now," Don Alio replied, his voice rough from a night of mezcal and fear. "You said you had a solution. I'm listening." Isadora stood by the wall near the heavy velvet curtains. She felt invisible, forgotten. Or maybe, she thought with a cold knot in her stomach, she was being kept there on purpose, a silent witness to her own sentencing. Vargas didn't even glance at her. He reached into his leather satchel and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. He laid it on the desk between them. It wasn't a map. It wasn't a military order. It was a proposal. "We have a prisoner," Vargas began, his voice smooth and low, like smoke curling from the barrel of a gun. "A Lakota, young but a respected fighter. He's the nephew of Chief Mapialuta, Red Cloud." He paused, letting the weight of the name settle in the room. "We captured him 3 days ago after a raid south of the Niobrara. He's valuable. The bloodline is strong." Don Alio stiffened, his eyes locked on the paper. Raphael, standing by the fireplace, folded his arms across his chest, his captain's uniform looking stiff and out of place. "So," Vargas continued, leaning forward and placing his palms flat on the desk, "we offer the chief something he can't refuse." His eyes flickered with a cold, predatory light. Not freedom for his nephew, not mercy. He paused again, a showman delivering his final shocking line. "A wife." Raphael snorted, a sharp, disbelieving sound. "You can't be serious, Colonel." "I am deadly serious, Captain," Vargas said, his gaze as hard as stone. And then he finally turned his eyes on Isadora. He looked at her not as a person, but as a solution, a tool. "And your sister is the only one who can make this work." Isadora didn't blink. She didn't gasp. In that single, horrifying moment, everything clicked into place. The shattered window, the tired feeling in her bones, the noose around her neck. She had known. Somehow, in a place deeper than thought, she had known this was coming from the moment the second bullet turned her mother's prayers into a cascade of broken glass. "A woman for peace," Vargas said, the words rolling off his tongue like a well-rehearsed speech. "It's an old solution, but still the most effective. Blood for blood, a life for a life, love for war." He smiled that dry smile again, or at least the illusion of it. Don Alio finally looked at his daughter, and in his eyes, she saw it all. Sorrow, yes, a flicker of shame. But underneath it all was the cold, hard glint of resignation. He had already made the choice. He was just waiting for the sacrifice to accept her fate. "Isadora?" he began, his voice cracking on her name. She held up a hand, a small, sharp gesture that cut him off mid-word. "Don't," she said, her own voice shaking, but only slightly. "You don't get to say my name right now." Vargas, ever the pragmatist, turned his full attention to her. He saw not a daughter, but a treaty. "You'll live in his village," he explained, as if discussing troop movements. "You will be a bridge between our worlds. Your presence as his wife could save dozens of lives, perhaps even hundreds. You would be a hero." Isadora let out a single, sharp bark of a laugh. It was a raw, ugly sound. "A hero? You're dressing up a cage and calling it a throne, Colonel." "You'd be honored," Vargas said smoothly, ignoring her outburst. The Lakota revere strong women. They value courage. You would be treated with respect." She stared at him, her mind racing, searching for a way out, an escape hatch in a room that had none. "And what happens? What happens if he says no?" she asked, the question hanging in the air like a guillotine. Vargas's smile vanished. His face became a flat, emotionless mask. "Then he dies," he said simply, "and the treaty dies with him. And the war that follows will start right here, on this land, with your family." The choice was never a choice at all. It was just a different kind of bullet. That evening, the family gathered for dinner. They sat at the long, polished table beneath the massive crystal chandelier imported from Spain. The chandelier swung gently in the drafty air, its crystals tinkling softly as if it could sense the tectonic shift in the family's fate. No one spoke. The silence was a physical thing, thick and suffocating. Her mother, Doña Inez, sat at the head of the table, her face pale, a rosary of black beads wrapped so tightly around her fingers that her knuckles were white. Raphael clenched his jaw, a muscle twitching in his cheek, so tight Isadora thought his teeth might shatter into dust. Her father, Don Alio, stared into his untouched plate of food as if searching for an answer in the glazed carrots. Isadora was the only one who seemed calm. She sipped her water, the glass cool against her lips. "I always thought," she said finally, her voice clear and steady in the crushing silence, "that if I ever left this house, it would be my choice." She looked from her mother's grieving face to her brother's simmering rage to her father's hollow shame. "I thought it would be because I loved someone, because I had a dream of my own. Not because you needed a daughter-shaped shield to hide behind." Her father opened his mouth to speak, to offer some useless apology, some hollow justification. But she didn't let him. She cut him off before the lie could form. "I'll go," she said. The silence that followed was even heavier than before. It was a silence of pure shock. Doña Inez gasped, a small, strangled sound. A single tear rolled down her cheek and splashed onto the table. "No, mija, please." "I'll go," Isadora repeated. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the stone floor. Her shadow stretched long across the table, across the untouched plates and gleaming silverware. She looked down at her father, and for the first time in her life he couldn't meet her gaze. "But let's not lie to ourselves about why." Her voice was like ice. "This isn't about saving lives. It's about saving land. It's about saving your name." Don Alio lowered his eyes, his face crumbling. Raphael shot to his feet, his fists clenched at his sides. "You don't have to do this, Isadora." "Yes," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I do. Because if I don't, someone else dies. Maybe you, maybe the ranch hands, maybe the children in that village." Her eyes bored into her brother's. "And I'm not like you, Raphael. I don't want that kind of blood on my hands." She turned and walked away from the table, from her family, from the life she had known. She left behind a silence so heavy it felt like it was bending the very air in the room. Before the first hint of dawn painted the sky, she was in the stable, alone. The air was cold and smelled of hay and horsehide. She saddled her own horse, a sturdy black mare named Sombra. Her hands moved with a steady, practiced rhythm, a small bundle of clothes, a leather pouch of coins, and a small, sharp knife, its handle worn smooth, tucked securely into a sheath beneath her belt, just in case. She heard footsteps behind her, softer than usual. It was Raphael. His captain's uniform was perfectly pressed, but his eyes looked 100 years old. "You're brave," he said, his voice hoarse. "No," she replied, not turning around, her fingers busy with a stubborn buckle. "I'm angry." She finally got the strap cinched tight and turned to face him. "But I'm learning I can be both." He held something out to her in the palm of his hand. A ring. a simple silver band with a small, deep blue turquoise stone. It was their mother's. She wore it every day until her hands grew too frail. "Don't forget where you come from," he whispered. She took the ring. She didn't put it on. She just closed her fist around it, the cool metal a small, hard reality in her palm, and slipped it into her pocket. She didn't look back at him. As the first soldiers arrived, their horses snorting in the pre-dawn chill, she mounted Sombra. She rode with them out of the stable yard, past the chapel with its shattered jewel-toned window, past the splintered gate still hanging from one hinge, past the vast stretches of land her father had bled for, and bled others for. And in her mind, a single thought echoed over and over with the rhythm of the horse's hooves. "You're being given away, but you are not a gift." She tightened her grip on the reins, her knuckles white. "If I'm supposed to be a peace offering, then let war have me first." The journey began, into a land she was taught to fear, to a man she was told was a savage, a man named Wicasa, silent, scarred, and shackled. But she was about to learn that nothing she had been told was the truth. And what was waiting for her over that ridge wasn't just danger. It was a transformation she could never have imagined. Dust was their only companion, a thick, red plume that trailed behind the convoy, a constant reminder of the world they were leaving behind as they cut a sharp line across the endless, empty plains. The horses moved at a steady, soul-crushing pace under a sky the color of old steel. The morning light had no warmth. It just illuminated a world painted in shades of warning. Ghost-pale grass, thorny brush reaching out like skeletal fingers, and the occasional bleached bones of an animal half buried in the earth, like a history that refused to stay silent. Isadora sat stiff-backed on her black mare, flanked by two soldiers who rode with their rifles across their laps and their eyes fixed firmly on the horizon. They never looked at her. Their silence was a strange sort of comfort, easier to bear than pity would have been. Ahead of her, a single wagon rattled and groaned, carrying supplies and the reason for this entire insane journey. The man they called the Lakota Savage, Wicasa Wajakanka. He was chained at the ankles, the iron cuffs glinting in the pale light. His hands were free now, a token gesture. It was a performance of power, she realized, probably for her benefit. His black hair, long and untamed, whipped around his face in the constant wind. He wore no shirt, only a pair of worn leather trousers and a thick band of faded red cloth tied around his left bicep. His skin was the color of dark bronze, but she could see a galaxy of dark bruises modeling the skin near his ribs. She noticed. Of course she noticed. He hadn't looked at her. Not once. Not when they loaded him into the wagon back at the ranch, not during the first stop for water at a muddy creek. Not even now, when the wind carried loose strands of her own dark hair into his peripheral vision. 3 hours into the ride, the silence became more than she could bear. It felt like a weight, pressing down on her. Her patience, already worn thin, finally snapped. "You can speak Spanish," she said, her voice louder than she intended, carrying easily in the quiet air. She aimed the words at the back of his head. "Or so I've been told." Still nothing. He didn't even flinch. It was like talking to a stone carving. She pressed forward, urging Sombra to walk beside the wagon. "I didn't ask for this either," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I'm not some prize they handed you in exchange for your silence." That got him. He turned his head slowly, just enough to glance at her from the corner of his eye. His eyes were darker than the storm clouds gathering on the western horizon, and they were filled with a startling intelligence. And fire. But it wasn't the wild, untamed fire of a savage she'd been warned about. No, this fire was controlled, contained, and that somehow scared her more than anything else. "I didn't ask for you," he said, his voice quiet but clear, spoken in a thickly accented but perfectly fluent Spanish. so don't flatter yourself." She blinked, taken aback by the directness, the sheer contempt in his tone. "Excuse me?" A corner of Wikasa's mouth curled up in something that was half amusement, half scorn. "They think giving me a woman will make me forget." He turned his head away, looking back at the empty plains. "Forget what they did, what they took from me. But I don't forget. Ever." "I'm not a part of your war," she shot back, stung by his words. "I didn't steal your land. I didn't kill your people." He turned his whole body this time, his chained legs shifting with a soft clink of metal. He didn't bother to slow his horse. He just stared at her, his dark eyes boring into hers. "You live on stolen land," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You eat food grown from it. Your family defends it with guns and fences and pieces of paper written in a language my people don't understand. You ride horses that were bred on the bones of our freedom." He leaned forward slightly. "You are the war." Isadora stared at him, her breath caught in her throat. She opened her mouth to argue, to defend herself, but no words came, because in her heart, in the secret, honest part of herself, she knew he was right. She had no answer for him, not yet. They rode in a new kind of silence after that. It wasn't the empty silence of before. This one was heavy, filled with the weight of hard truths that neither of them knew how to hold without getting cut. By the time they made camp that night, the wind had picked up, howling a lonely, mournful song. The soldiers pitched their small tents near a dry riverbed, the canvas flapping wildly, and gathered brittle wood for a fire. Wikasa was unchained from the wagon, though two soldiers with rifles never strayed more than a few feet from him. Isadora's tent was staked a good distance apart from the rest, a clear, unspoken message. She didn't belong to the soldiers anymore, but she certainly didn't belong to Wikasa either. She was in between, an island, invisible and yet the center of everyone's attention. She sat by her own small, sputtering fire, rubbing her hands together. She looked down at her palms and was surprised to see the beginnings of calluses. She'd always worn gloves on the ranch. Now her hands were starting to tell a new story, one she hadn't agreed to write. Wikasa moved across the small encampment like a shadow. He was silent, watchful, his body a testament to a life of hardship and war. But his posture, upright, proud, unapologetic, told another story. He was a prisoner, but he was not broken. He didn't sit with the soldiers. He didn't look at her again. But later, when the wind howled so fiercely it threatened to rip her tent from the ground, and the soldiers had all turned in for the night, she saw him through the flap. He was by her fire pit. He was carefully, methodically stacking stones around it, creating a windbreak. She didn't ask why. She didn't say a word. But when she woke in the frigid darkness hours later, and her fire was still burning, a small, steady beacon of warmth against the raging gusts, she understood. It wasn't kindness. It was survival. And for now, her survival was linked to his. The second day was colder. The sun rose late and weak, a pale coin in a colorless sky. They passed through a landscape of badlands, a maze of wind-carved rock towers that loomed over them like ancient, silent watchmen. Isadora found herself watching Wikasa more and more. Not out of simple curiosity anymore. She was learning to read him, to read the land through his posture. When he sat up taller, she instinctively tightened her grip on her reins. When he slowed his horse, she scanned the barren hills, her eyes searching for a danger she couldn't yet see. She didn't know exactly when she had started to trust his instincts over those of the soldiers who were supposed to be protecting her, but it had already happened. Around midday, they stopped in a narrow canyon to water the horses. The soldiers wandered off, seeking privacy among the rocks. For a few minutes, Isidora found herself alone with Wikasa again. The towering canyon walls closed in around them, their silence feeling like a form of quiet judgment. She slid off her horse and walked to the shallow stream, the hem of her dress already muddy and torn. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, the words coming out stronger than she felt. He didn't respond, just knelt by the water, splashing his face. "I don't care what they say about your people," she added, pressing on. "You bleed the same as we do. You grieve the same as we do. You lose the same as we do." He looked at her then. For the first time, his gaze wasn't hard or filled with contempt. It softened. Just a little. Just for a second. But it was enough. He finished washing his hands, then stood and walked past her. He stopped a few feet away, his back still to her. "Don't speak of what you don't know," he said, his voice low, "but you will see." And then he kept walking, leaving her alone by the water. That night, she watched him as he slept by the main fire, alone as always, his arms crossed behind his head, his face turned up toward the vast, star-filled sky. He looked like he'd made some sort of secret pact with the heavens. She found herself wondering, with a strange mix of dread and anticipation, what would happen when they finally reached his village. Would they welcome her? Would they hate her? Would he still sleep outside her tent, a silent guardian? Or would he burn the tent to the ground just to remind her and everyone else that she was never, ever supposed to be there? But deep in her chest, a strange new feeling was flickering to life. It wasn't fear. It wasn't resentment. It was the beginning of a question. A dangerous, thrilling question. What if they're all wrong? What if I'm the one who decides how this story ends? They reached the final ridge just before dusk on the third day, and below them, nestled in the protective belly of a wide, green basin, was the Lakota village. It wasn't the chaotic, savage camp she had been led to imagine. Tents, painted with symbols and stories, were arranged in a perfect, harmonious circle, like the spokes of a great wheel. A central fire pit glowed, sending a steady column of smoke curling up into the twilight sky. The sounds that drifted up to them weren't war cries. They were the sounds of life. Children laughing as they ran, dogs barking, and underneath it all the low, steady, rhythmic beat of a drum, like the heartbeat of the land itself. Isadora's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't a place of savages. This was a place of memory, a place of grief. Yes, she could feel that in the air. But it was also a place of resilience, a place of endurance. Wakasa reined in his horse beside her. He didn't smile. He didn't offer any words of comfort. He just looked down at the village, his home, and said, "This is where your real journey begins." Then he dismounted without another word and started walking down the trail. And Isadora knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that nothing her father, her brother, or Colonel Vargas had told her had prepared her for what was about to happen next. She took a deep breath, whispered, "But you will see me," to the empty air, and urged Sombra forward, down into the heart of the storm. The village was alive with sound, but as she entered, a wave of silence rolled out to meet her. As Isadora rode past the edge of the Lakota camp, every eye turned her way. Dozens of them. Women who were stirring pots over open fires paused, their hands frozen in midair. Children who had been playing games of chase stopped and ducked behind their mothers' skirts, peeking out with wide, silent curiosity. The men, some with long braids threaded with beads reaching down to their waists, their faces carved with the lines of time and war, simply stared. Their expressions were unreadable. Blank stone. No one greeted her. No one moved closer. The only sound was the soft thud of Sombra's hooves on the hard-packed earth and the steady, rhythmic beat of her own heart, thudding against her ribs like a fist against a locked door. Wakasa walked calmly ahead of her, not looking back, as if he were bringing home something completely ordinary, like a bundle of firewood, and not a living, breathing woman from the world, that was trying to erase his. She followed, keeping her back straight, her chin high, fighting the urge to turn and flee back up the trail. A group of older women stood near the center of the camp, their arms crossed, blocking the way. They parted for them as they approached, but not with welcoming smiles. One of them, a woman with sharp cheekbones and eyes like chips of obsidian, muttered something in Lakota. Isadora didn't understand the words, but the tone was universal. Disdain, resentment, maybe even betrayal. Wakasa stopped at a small, isolated tent near the very edge of the camp, set away from the inner circle where the main families lived. He lifted the hide flap and gestured inside with a jerk of his head. "You'll sleep here." It was little more than a crude hide shelter, spare and cold. She peeked inside, a pile of buffalo pelts on the dirt floor, 2 simple clay pots, nothing else, no welcome. No scent of sweetgrass or herbs burning. No sign that anyone had prepared it for a guest. It was the tent of an outcast. "Where will you sleep?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Outside," he said, already turning and walking away. She watched as he spread a single thin blanket on the ground near the cold fire pit a few yards from her tent. The message was deliberate and clear. This was not a union. This was not a marriage. This was a boundary line drawn in the dirt. He was her keeper, not her husband. She turned and went into the cold, empty tent, and behind her the whispers began, rising up like smoke from a dying fire. By morning, Isadora's feet were numb with cold. The buffalo pelts were surprisingly warm, but the relentless wind found every seam in the tent, cutting through like small, sharp blades. She wrapped herself tighter in a wool blanket from her own saddle roll and listened. She listened to the sounds of life waking up all around her. The coughing of old men, the splashing of water being drawn from a nearby stream, the light patter of small, bare feet chasing dogs through the camp. She finally pushed aside the flap and stepped outside. The world greeted her with more of the same crushing silence from the day before. Across the central fire circle, a woman with broad shoulders and 2 long gray braids watched her. Her face was a mask of stern disapproval. Isadora gave a slight, polite nod. The woman stared for a second longer, then deliberately turned her back. The rejection was as sharp as a slap. Isadora walked toward the center of the camp, drawn by the rhythm of morning chores. Women were kneading dough, sharpening tools on flat stones, scraping and washing animal hides, stretched on wooden frames. Her instinct, born from a life on a busy ranch, was to offer help. But she didn't know how. No one made eye contact with her. She felt like a ghost walking among the living, a phantom they had all agreed to ignore. Then a voice, sharp and hard, cut through the air behind her. "You think standing there looking useless makes you useful?" Isadora turned. The woman who had spoken was shorter than her, but she had a presence as solid and unmovable as a cliff face. Her eyes were hard, her hands were scarred and calloused, and her face was beautiful in the way a storm is beautiful, dangerous and relentless. It was the same woman who had turned her back on her earlier. "I don't know what would make me useful to you," Isadora said, keeping her voice calm and even. "But I would like to learn." The woman snorted, a sound of pure derision. "You think saying that in your soft Spanish earns you respect? Here, words don't feed children, words don't patch tents against the winter wind." "What does?" Isadora asked, her voice firm, refusing to be intimidated. "Hands that bleed," the woman said, holding up her own scarred palms. "Not hands that write letters or pour wine from a crystal glass." Isadora didn't hesitate. She held out her own hands, palms up. They were soft, yes, but not unblemished. There were small scars from rose thorns, a burn mark from a careless moment by the stove. "They've bled before," she said softly. And they can bleed again. I don't expect your kindness. Only a chance. The woman studied her for a long, silent moment, her hard eyes searching Isadora's face for any sign of weakness or deceit. Finally, she gave a curt nod toward a large, messy stack of freshly skinned deer hides. "Show me how you clean one," she said. "If you ruin it, we feed it to the dogs." The hours that followed were a blur of agony. Her fingers, unused to the rough work, quickly grew sore, then blistered, then bled. Her back screamed in protest from bending over the hide. Flies, drawn by the smell of raw flesh, bit at her skin, and the stench of it clung to her clothes and hair. But she didn't complain. She didn't even wince. When she made a mistake, she grit her teeth and corrected it. When the older woman, whose name she eventually learned was Elsie, barked a correction at her, she listened and obeyed. By dusk, Isadora's hands were a raw, bleeding mess. She could barely make a fist. "You can stop now," Elsie said, her tone unchanged. "That's enough for one day." Isadora looked up from her work, her face streaked with sweat and dirt. Her entire body ached, but she shook her head. "I'd rather finish this one," she said, her voice rough, "even if it takes me all night." A flicker of something unreadable passed over Elsie's stern face. It wasn't approval. Not yet. But it was something close to it. Respect, maybe. "You're stubborn," Elsie muttered, turning to walk away. "Like a Lakota girl?" Isadora asked, a small, tired smile touching her lips. "Or like a mule?" Elsie stopped and looked back over her shoulder. A low, dark chuckle rumbled in her chest. "I'll take a mule over a coward any day." Then she was gone. That night, the small fire outside Isadora's tent felt warmer. Wicasa sat near her tent, not on his usual spot on the ground, but on a log. He was sharpening a long, wicked-looking blade with slow, steady strokes of a whetstone. The sound was rhythmic, almost calming. "You worked hard today," he said, his eyes still on the blade. "Is that your way of saying thank you?" she asked, leaning wearily against the tent frame. "I didn't ask you to do it," he replied without looking up. She watched the firelight dance on the steel of his knife. "I know," she said softly. "That's why it matters." He paused his work. The blade in his hand gleamed in the firelight. For a long moment he was silent. Then he spoke, his voice low and heavy with a grief that felt ancient. "She was my sister," he said finally. "Elsie. The one they killed when they took me." Isadora didn't respond. She didn't offer empty words of condolence. She knew they would mean nothing. She just sat in the silence and let it carry the weight of his words. "They burned our tents," he continued, his voice flat, emotionless, which was somehow more chilling than if he had been shouting. "They shot my horse from under me, and they put a knife in her ribs while she was trying to shield her son." He still hadn't looked at her. His hands holding the knife had stopped moving. "They didn't ask her name," he said. "Just like no one here has asked yours." He stood abruptly and walked away into the darkness, leaving her alone with the fire, the weight of his story, and the sudden, chilling realization that the blood debt between their peoples was deeper and more personal than she had ever imagined. In the days that followed, things began to change, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The children no longer ran and hid when she passed. Sometimes they would even stare, their curiosity winning out over their fear. The women stopped spitting on the ground near her feet. Elsie, in her own gruff way, started giving her other tasks, stitching moccasins for the young ones, mending a tier in a tent. Her first attempts were clumsy, laughable. She failed twice before she finally got one pair of moccasins right. The smallest child in the village, a little boy barely 5 years old, giggled with delight as he tried them on and ran in circles. Isadora had to bite the inside of her cheek to keep from crying. The second week, A fierce storm rolled through the plains, bringing with it a biting wind and a cold, driving rain. She and Wicasa worked together, side by side, securing the flaps of her tent, their movements efficient and synchronized, no words needed between them. When it was done, just before the sky opened up, he handed her a thick, heavy woven shawl. For the cold, was all he said. No thank you, no smile, not even a glance. But he had given it to her anyway. The murmurs in the village began to shift. Some still said she was faking her humility, that it was a trick. Some whispered that she was cursed, a bad omen. But some, a growing number, began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she had been chosen by the spirits for a reason they didn't yet understand. One afternoon, as she was hauling 2 heavy buckets of water from the stream, a young girl ran past her, then shouted back over her shoulder, "White woman with warrior hands!" Isadora didn't know whether to laugh or cry. As she stood there, catching her breath, Elsie appeared beside her, carrying a leather pouch filled with fragrant herbs. "You want to stay alive here, girl?" Elsie said, her voice low but firm, her eyes fixed on the distant storm clouds. "Then you better learn to bleed like one of us." Isadora turned, her chin lifted, her own eyes meeting Elsie's without fear. "I already am," she said. That night, just as the last of the storm was passing, a scout returned to the village, his horse lathered in sweat, his face grim. He brought a dire warning. 3 of the village's children, 2 girls and a boy, had not returned from playing in the canyons to the west. Darkness was falling fast. And with the darkness came the cold, the wolves, and worse things. The entire village seemed to hold its breath. Wicasa stood up from the council fire, his face set like stone. "I will go," he said. And then, before anyone could protest or volunteer to join him, he did something that sent a shockwave of disbelief through the assembled crowd. He turned and pointed directly at Isadora. "She is coming with me!" The crowd erupted in a chorus of Lakota voices, shock, disbelief, anger. Even Elsie stared, her mouth slightly agape. Isadora didn't move. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. Her eyes never left his. He had chosen her. In front of everyone. Now, she had to prove why. The canyon was waiting. Her moment of truth was no longer coming. It had arrived. The canyon was a black, jagged wound in the earth, looming like a broken jaw beneath the sliver of a moon. Its craggy walls clawed at the night sky, and the wind that whistled through its narrow passages sounded like something lost and crying, or something ancient and warning. At the edge of the trail, a small group of warriors stood with torches held high, their breath rising in white, ghostly plumes in the frigid air. Isadora pulled the heavy shawl Wicasa had given her tighter around her shoulders, trying to still the violent shaking in her knees. It wasn't just the cold. It was the weight of all those eyes on her. No one said it aloud, but she could hear the question in every skeptical glance, in the tense set of their shoulders. What is she doing here? She isn't blood. She isn't kin. She isn't one of us. But Wicasa had spoken, and in this village, when he spoke, the earth itself seemed to listen. "She has sharp eyes," he had said to the concerned circle of elders back at the camp. "Her hands are small. If the children are trapped somewhere narrow, she might be able to reach them when we cannot." It hadn't been a compliment. It was cold, hard logic. It was about her usefulness. But it was also the first time he had publicly acknowledged her as something more than just a burden, a political prisoner. It was a test. And as she stood beside him now at the mouth of the dark canyon, she understood with chilling clarity what that really meant. This wasn't just a test of her skill, it was a test of her heart. "Keep close," Wicasa said, his voice a low rumble. He handed her a burning torch, its flames dancing wildly in the wind. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak, and followed him in. Behind them, 2 other warriors came along. Swift Bear, a man as lean and quiet as the wind itself, and Red Clay, broader, older, with watchful eyes that made it clear he didn't trust her one bit. They moved in silence, their footsteps muffled by the sandy floor of the winding pass. The moon dipped lower behind the canyon walls, and the shadows grew longer, twisting into grotesque shapes that played tricks on the eyes. A coyote howled in the distance, a lonely, chilling sound that was answered by the scream of a hawk high above. Then silence again, a heavy, listening silence. Wakasa suddenly stopped and crouched near a patch of disturbed dust, holding his torch low. "Tracks," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Little ones. Bare feet." He touched the ground gently, the way a priest might touch a sacred cloth. 3 sets, 2 girls, 1 boy. "Are they together?" Isadora asked, keeping her own voice low. Wakasa didn't answer right away. He stood and pointed his chin deeper into the canyon, where the rock walls narrowed into a dark, foreboding slit. They pressed on. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Isadora's arm burned from the strain of holding the heavy torch aloft. The biting cold had seeped through her gloves, and her fingers had gone numb. The blisters on her feet from her first days in the village had reopened, sending sharp jolts of pain up her legs with every step. Her breath clouded in front of her face like smoke. Still, she said nothing. She would not give them a single reason to question why Wakasa had brought her. Then she heard it. A soft, almost inaudible sound, nearly lost in the whistling of the wind. She froze. "Did you hear that?" Wakasa raised a hand, signaling for silence. They all stopped, their heads cocked, listening. There it was again, a faint, terrified whimper. "A child," Swift Bear whispered, his voice tight. Wakasa moved toward the sound like a panther, silent and fluid, his torch scanning the rock walls. "There," he pointed. Between 2 massive, leaning slabs of stone, there was a narrow opening, a dark crevice no wider than Isadora's shoulders. He knelt, lowering his torch to peer inside, a flash of movement, the glint of tiny, tear-filled eyes. The 3 missing children were huddled inside a small, hollowed-out rock chamber. The boy, the oldest, had his arms wrapped around the 2 younger girls, trying to shield them. They were safe from the cold and the predators for now, but they were trapped. Wakasa tried to reach into the crevice, testing its width. He shook his head. "Too tight," he said, his voice laced with frustration. "A man's shoulders would get stuck." His dark eyes found Isadora's. She didn't wait for him to ask. She didn't wait for instruction. "Give me the rope," she said, her voice steady and clear. Red Clay looked ready to object. "She's not trained for this," he argued, his distrust evident. "She could get hurt, or worse." "She is already here," Wakasa replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "She gets to decide what she will risk." Isadora was already tying the rope securely around her waist. "You don't have to do this," Wakasa started to say, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. She looked at him sharply, her eyes flashing in the torchlight. "Yes," she said. "I do." Then a small, grim smile touched her lips. "Everything in my life has been a danger I didn't choose," she said. "At least this time, I get to choose my own." Without another word, she dropped to her knees and began to slide into the tight, dark crevice. The rough stone tore at the sleeves of her dress, her torch barely fit, its flames licking at the rock inches from her face. Her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps as the space closed in around her. The claustrophobia was a physical weight, crushing her chest. Fine, cold dirt filled her mouth. Her braid snagged on a sharp jut of rock, pulling her head back with a painful jerk. But she kept going. She kept wriggling forward because she could hear the soft, terrified crying of the children, and she knew that no one else could reach them. She slipped through the last, tightest gap and tumbled into the small, dark chamber. The air inside was warm and stifling, thick with the smell of fear. One of the little girls had a nasty cut on her leg. The boy's lips were cracked and bleeding from thirst. "It's okay," Isadora whispered in the broken Lakota she had learned. "I'm here. I'm here to take you home." The smallest girl, who couldn't have been more than 4, began to sob uncontrollably. Isadora worked quickly. She untied the rope from her own waist and secured it gently but firmly around the little girl's. She crawled back to the opening and called out, her voice muffled. "Ready?" Slowly, carefully, the girl was lifted out, trembling and crying. Then the second girl, then the boy. Each one felt like a small, precious heartbeat, being passed from the darkness back into the world of the living. Finally, it was her turn. She tied the rope around herself again. But as she turned to crawl back toward the opening, her foot slipped on a loose rock. The torch, which she had propped up, fell and went out, plunging her into absolute, terrifying darkness. Panic, cold and sharp, rose in her throat, clawing at her ribs. She gasped for air, and a spray of loose dirt fell into her open mouth, choking her. "This is it," she thought. "This is where I die." Then, strong hands gripped her wrists. Warm, powerful hands, pulling her. She was being dragged out of the blackness. She emerged coughing, sobbing, shaking uncontrollably, and collapsed onto the sandy ground. Wakasa was on his knees, his arms still around her, holding her steady. "You are okay," he said, his face close to hers. And for the first time, he didn't say it like a command. He said it like a prayer. When they returned to the village, with the children wrapped in blankets and carried in the warriors' arms, the entire camp was waiting. Mothers screamed with relief, running to snatch their babies. Fathers, stoic warriors, wept openly, unashamed. And Isadora? She stood a little behind Wakasa, her clothes torn and filthy, her hands scraped raw, her face smeared with a mixture of her own blood and dust. But she stood tall, and for the first time, people saw her. They really saw her, not as the white woman, not as the price for a treaty. They saw a woman who had walked into the darkness and come back carrying life. That night, the camp was lit up with celebratory fires. The drums beat a rhythm of gratitude. The children, safe and warm, were wrapped in thick furs and fed hot, nourishing soup. Later, as the celebration began to wind down, Wakasa approached her where she sat by a quiet fire, away from the main circle. He didn't approach her as a guardian or as a captor. He approached her as something else entirely. "You have the heart of a warrior," he said. His voice was quiet, but every word landed with the force of thunder. She looked up at him, the exhaustion so thick in her bones it was a physical weight. But her spirit felt like it was on fire. "No," she said softly. "I just finally got the chance to prove it." He didn't smile, but she saw the smile in his eyes. Across the fire, Elsie watched them, and for the very first time, she gave Isadora a single, slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't approval, not yet. It wasn't even acceptance, but it was something just as powerful. It was recognition. Wakasa walked her back to her tent that night. He didn't say goodnight. He didn't touch her. But he stood outside, a silent silhouette against the firelight, until her own small fire was burning steady and strong. And when she peeked through the hide flap just before sleep finally took her, she saw that he was still there. He was guarding her tent, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. She heard his voice, a low, reverent whisper on the wind. "You don't belong to them anymore," he said. "Not after tonight." Word of the rescue spread through the village like a warm wind. Isadora was no longer just an outsider. She was the woman who had crawled into the earth to save their children. But peace, she was learning, was a fragile, fleeting thing. And the next test wasn't going to come from a dark canyon or the suspicious eyes of the tribe. It was going to come from her own people. Because a new threat was approaching, and this time, it would force Isadora to make an impossible choice. Remain silent and protect her newfound place in the village, or risk it all to defend compassion in a land that seemed to only understand the language of vengeance. Smoke was rising from the west. It wasn't the thick, dark smoke of a large fire. It was thin, gray tendrils curling lazily into the late morning sky. Too faint to be a signal fire, but too steady to be a simple campfire. The scouts who had been out on patrol returned on horseback at a full gallop, their faces tight with unease. They brought news wrapped in ash and tension. A settler family, a Mexican woman, her white husband, and their 2 small children, had made a crude camp near the sacred spring. They were sick, too weak to keep moving, and too ignorant or desperate to know that they had trespassed on holy ground. The reaction from the village was swift and fierce. Voices rose around the central fire, a chorus of anger and fear. The sacred spring wasn't just a source of water. It was the spiritual heart of the village. The Lakota believed it was where the spirits of their ancestors whispered to them through the cool water and the smooth, moss-covered stones. No outsiders were ever allowed near it, and certainly not anyone dying of a fever, their sickness a poison that could taint the holy water. "They must be removed before they desecrate the source," one of the elders declared, his voice trembling with righteous anger. "If they're sick, they'll die anyway," muttered another man. "Let the earth take them back. It is their punishment for trespassing." "They crossed the line," growled Red Clay, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "We should send them back across it, on their backs." Isadora stood at the edge of the angry crowd, her heart thudding a heavy, anxious rhythm against her ribs. The wind carried the familiar scent of sweetgrass from the camp, but underneath it was something else, something sour and wrong. The smell of illness, the smell of fear, the smell of old, simmering anger. She took a deep breath and stepped forward into the circle. "I can help them," she said, her voice clear and strong. The angry chatter stopped instantly. The silence that fell was as sudden and sharp as a dropped blade. Every eye turned to her. Elsie, standing near the fire, narrowed her eyes. "Help them? I've seen this fever before," Isadora said, her gaze moving from one hostile face to the next. "On my father's ranch. It comes on fast, and it can kill fast. But not always. If it's treated early with the right herbs, they can survive. They will be strong enough to leave on their own." "And what if they don't leave?" Red Clay snapped, stepping toward her. "What if they are just a trick? What if they infect the spring with their corpses?" "Then it's already too late, isn't it?" she replied calmly, refusing to back down. "They are there right now, dying. As we speak, their sickness seeps into the ground. You have 2 choices. We can heal them and send them away, clean and alive. Or we can let them die and risk their disease being carried into your water for generations." Whispers and murmurs rippled through the crowd. She had given them a choice they hadn't considered. Not one of vengeance, but one of logic and survival. Then Wikasa's voice cut through all of it, deep and decisive. "I will go with her." Heads turned toward him in shock. "You will defend the white woman again?" Someone spat from the crowd. "I will defend the land," Wikasa said, his eyes scanning the faces around him. "And I will defend the spring. If she is wrong, if she fails, I will finish what needs to be done." No one spoke after that. His word was final. The decision was made. They rode out within the hour. As they moved west, the land changed. It became flatter, hotter, drier. The lush grass of the basin turned to brown dust. The trees became skeletal, twisted shadows of themselves. And then, in a low, dusty hollow between two large stone outcroppings, they saw it. A pathetic, makeshift camp, a family of 4, looking more like ghosts than people. The father lay half-conscious under a single fraying blanket, his face waxy and pale, sweat beading on his neck. The mother knelt beside him, her own body trembling with weakness, trying to keep their 2 young children upright. Both children were crying, but it was a quiet, high-pitched, exhausted sound with no energy left behind it. Isadora dismounted before Sombra had even fully stopped. The mother looked up, her eyes wide with terror. She reached feebly for a rusted rifle lying beside her on the ground. Wicasa stepped forward, holding his hands up, palms out. "We are not here to harm you." Isadora knelt beside the woman, her movements slow and gentle. "I am a healer," she said in Spanish. "We can help you." The woman blinked, her eyes dazed with fever and disbelief. "Why? Why would you help us?" Isadora looked at the 2 small, whimpering children and then back at the mother. "Because if I don't," she said softly, "your children will die." The next few hours passed in a frantic blur of work and fire. Wicasa built a small, efficient fire while Isadora got to work. She crushed dried herbs she had brought between 2 flat stones, willow bark to fight the fever, yarrow to slow the spread of the sickness. She dissolved salt from her own small pouch into warm water. She gently cleaned the children's cracked lips. She used cool, damp cloths to wipe the sweat from their faces. She lifted the mother's wrist and felt the slow, faint thud of a dying heart. They were close to death, but they were lucky. She had gotten here in time. Hours later, as the sun began to set, the father stirred and asked for water. The children finally stopped their quiet crying and fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. A touch of color returned to the mother's pale cheeks. The worst had passed. Isadora sat back on her heels, her whole body aching, her hands shaking from exhaustion. Her braid was stuck to the back of her neck with sweat. Across the small fire, Wicasa watched her, his expression unreadable. "You did not have to do this," he said, his voice a low rumble. She looked at him, the full weight of her exhaustion pressing down on her. "Yes," she said, "I did." By sundown, the mother, whose name was Mariana, was able to sit up on her own. She looked at Isadora, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "You don't belong with them," she said, her voice thin and weak as she gestured vaguely in the direction of the Lakota village. Isadora's gaze drifted toward the sacred spring, its water bubbling up clear and pure from the earth. "Yes," she said quietly, "I do." "They will never see you as one of them," Mariana insisted. "I don't need them to," Isadora replied, her voice gaining strength. "I just need to be someone I can live with." Mariana reached out and touched Isadora's hand. "You already are," she whispered. That night, Wicasa and Isadora made their camp near the spring, not beside the settlers, but close enough to hear if they needed help. The sky above them was a vast, dark canvas, and the stars were so bright they looked like diamonds scattered on black velvet. She lay on her back, staring up at them, her mind too tired to think. He sat beside her, feeding small sticks into the fire. "I used to come here when I was a boy," he said suddenly, his voice soft. "Before all of this." She turned her head to look at him. "Before what?" "Before they killed my uncle. Before my people learned to bury their hope under ash. Before a treaty became just another word for a lie. Before our only inheritance was gunpowder and grief." He looked toward the spring, his face illuminated by the firelight. "This was the one place we believed could never be taken from us. The one place that was truly ours." She didn't speak knowing he needed to. "I thought you would be like the rest of them," he admitted, his gaze still on the spring. "Pretty, soft, silent, breakable. She smiled faintly. "And I thought you would be cruel." They sat in that raw, shared honesty for a long time. Then he looked directly at her, his dark eyes seeming to see right through her. "Why did you really do it, Isadora? Why did you risk angering my people to save hers?" She turned her eyes from the stars to the sacred spring, the gentle wind rustling the dry grass all around them. "Because I wanted to prove something," she said, "to them and to myself. I wanted to prove that I can protect this place just as much as any warrior who was born here." She looked back at him, her own gaze unwavering. Saving them, getting them to leave on their own 2 feet, protected this spring better than killing them and leaving their bodies to rot ever could have. Wakasa stared at her, and for the first time, she didn't look away. A slow, profound understanding dawned in his eyes. "You understand more about being Lakota than some who were born to it," he said quietly. "Being a warrior doesn't always mean fighting. Sometimes it means knowing when not to." She reached for the fire and tossed a small sprig of cedar onto the flames. It hissed and popped, releasing a fragrant, holy smoke. They watched it burn together, the silence between them no longer empty, but filled with a new, unspoken connection. In the morning, the settler family left. They were still weak, but they were alive. They left grateful, unarmed, and quiet. Wakasa stood beside Isadora as they watched the family disappear into the golden light of the rising sun. "They won't forget this," he said. "I don't want them to," she replied. They rode home in silence, but it wasn't the kind of silence that divides. It was the kind that says, "I see you, I understand you," and you stayed. That night, when they returned to the village, something had shifted in the air. As she walked through the camp, people looked at her and nodded. A few even offered small, hesitant smiles. Later, Elsie came to her tent and placed a single, beautifully woven bracelet made of brightly colored threads on the ground outside. It was a gift, a symbol, recognition. As she was building her fire for the night, Wakasa approached her. He was carrying a small object in his hand. It was a bone carving, intricately detailed, shaped like a hawk in full flight. "For you," he said, placing it gently in her palm. The bone was smooth and cool to the touch. "Why?" she asked, her voice a whisper. He looked from the carving in her hand to her face, his expression serious. "Because when the fire of anger dies down," he said, "you are still the one who finds a way to keep us warm." He gently brushed his fingers against hers, a touch so light it was like the whisper of a wing. "If this is a war," he said, his voice low and intense, "then I hope I never win it." But peace, she knew, never lasts, because from the east a new sound was coming, the sound of soldiers, a column of riders heading directly for the village, led by someone who knew her name, her father, her brother, her past. The life she had left behind was charging back to reclaim her. And this time, it wasn't asking for permission. The sound of the horses came first. It was a distant, rhythmic thudding, too organized, too measured to be a wild herd. Isadora was on her knees, gathering herbs near the edge of the village when she heard it. It sounded like thunder lined with iron. Her heart dropped into the pit of her stomach even before her mind caught up. She stood up, shielding her eyes with her hand, and turned toward the east, toward the vast, open plain. And there they were. A column of blue coats, the sun glinting off their rifles, a flag flapping in the wind. A long line of U.S. cavalry riders moving with a grim, relentless purpose, their formation as sharp and deadly as a blade. This wasn't a patrol. It wasn't a search party. This was a statement. The scout on the ridge sounded the warning call, a high, piercing cry that sliced through the peaceful morning air. Instantly, the village erupted. Drums began to pound a frantic, urgent rhythm. Women grabbed their children, pulling them inside the hide tents. Men scrambled for their weapons, pulling rifles from leather wraps and bows from bone hooks. The fragile peace of the village cracked, like thin ice under a heavy boot. Isadora dropped her satchel of herbs and ran. She ran as fast as she could toward the center of the camp. By the time she reached the central fire, Wicasa was already there, shouting orders. "They will reach us before dusk," he said, his voice calm but sharp with urgency. "We prepare to defend. If they fire the first shot, we do not hesitate." Elsie stood at his side, her arms folded across her chest, her lips a thin, tight line. "Or," she said, her voice cutting through the rising panic, "we send someone to talk before it comes to blood." Wicasa turned toward her, his face grim. "And who among us do you think they would listen to?" Then his eyes, and the eyes of everyone else in the circle, found Isadora. She didn't need to ask. She already knew. They rode out to meet the cavalry as the column crested the last ridge before the basin. Just two riders against a small army. Wicasa and Isadora. She could feel the pressure in her ribs, the deep, old tension of facing the ghosts of her past in the harsh light of day. The cavalry column halted when they saw her. She saw ripples of surprise on the faces of the soldiers. Then one man urged his horse forward, his uniform stiff and immaculate, his eyes like polished empty glass. Captain Rafael Herrera, her brother. He stared at her as if he were seeing a ghost. He looked older than she remembered, gaunter, harder. But the expression on his face was painfully familiar, a volatile mix of fierce protectiveness and bitter betrayal. "You," he said. His voice cracked on the single word. She nodded once, her face unreadable. "Me." Wicasa sat on his horse beside her, silent and still as a mountain, his hand resting lightly on his hip, just above where a long knife was sheathed. Raphael's eyes shifted from her to him, and they narrowed with sharp, instant hatred. "What have they done to you?" Raphael demanded, his voice shaking with rage. Isadora had to swallow the hysterical laugh that rose in her throat. "Nothing I didn't choose," she said. "You're being used, Issa. Can't you see that? They've twisted your mind." "No," she said, her voice as cold and clear as the spring water. "I was being used before. Now, for the first time in my life, I'm living." He urged his horse a few steps closer, lowering his voice. "You left us. You left Mother. She weeps every night." "I was sold, Raphael," she snapped back, her own anger flaring. "Don't you ever forget who signed the treaty with my name on it?" His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching violently in his cheek. "We came to retrieve you," he said, his voice becoming cold and official. "And to deliver a message. There have been raids on the southern trails. Livestock stolen. A settler family killed." Wicasa finally spoke, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "We had no part in that." "It doesn't matter," Raphael said coldly, his eyes locking on Wicasa. "Command sees no distinction between one tribe and another. They want all the tribes pushed north, off federal land, permanently." "They will fight back," Isadora warned. "Then we will burn them out," her brother snapped. Wicasa urged his horse forward, placing himself slightly in front of Isadora. "If you strike this village," he said, his voice calm but carrying a heavy threat, "there will be a war you will not win." "There already is a war," Raphael said, his eyes never leaving Wicasa's. He then looked at Isadora. "Bring her back to me now," he ordered Wicasa. Isadora nudged Sombra forward, placing herself between the two men. She turned her gaze on her brother, her voice as clear as ice cracking over a frozen river. "No." Raphael stiffened as if she had struck him. "You would betray your own blood for them?" he whispered, his voice full of disbelief and pain. She looked back at Wicasa, then at the thin column of smoke rising from the village behind him. Her home. "I'm not betraying anyone," she said. I'm protecting what I believe in, something none of you ever let me do." Raphael's hand drifted down, hovering just over the butt of his pistol. Instantly, Wakasa tensed, his body coiling like a snake ready to strike. But before either man could make a fatal move, Isadora stepped her horse directly between them, breaking their line of sight. "No one," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that surprised even herself, "pulls a weapon. Not today." The three of them sat there on their horses, frozen in a tense tableau under the vast, indifferent sky. After a long, heart-pounding silence, Raphael slowly dropped his hand away from his gun. "3 days," he said finally, his voice flat and dead. "That's what the army is giving you. 3 days to abandon this basin. After that, we have orders for a forced removal." He looked directly at Isadora, his eyes cold as stone. "You stay here, and you will die with them." He turned his horse, pulling sharply on the reins. "And you," he said, looking at her one last time over his shoulder, his voice filled with a terrible finality, "are no longer a Herrera." Then he and his soldiers rode off, and the plains were silent once again. That night, the village council gathered. The air in the main tent was thick with tension, humming like the static before a lightning strike. "We must leave," said one of the elders, his voice heavy with sorrow. "We will take the children and the old ones and go north into the mountains." "We fight," said another, a young warrior, his voice full of fire. "This is our land. If we run every time they bark at us, we will lose our roots, our connection to the ancestors." Elsie turned her sharp, intelligent eyes to Isadora. "You know this army. You know your brother. What will they do?" Isadora's voice was low, but it carried a terrible certainty. "They'll come," she said, "and they will shoot first. They will kill anyone who doesn't kneel." A heavy silence fell over the council. Then Wakasa stood up. His presence filled the tent. "We do not kneel," he said. "And we do not run," Elsie added, her voice firm. "But we also do not throw our people into certain death for the sake of pride," Isadora said, standing to face them. "Not if there is another way." Wakasa met her eyes across the fire. "What are you thinking?" She looked around the circle, at the faces of the people who had become her family, her heart pounding in her chest. "We send a rider," she said, "not with a message of surrender, with a message of truth. We send someone who knows their way of speaking, their world. Someone who can show them the people who live here, the children, the elders, the mothers, not just the warriors they expect to see." Elsie scoffed. "And you truly believe they will listen?" "No," Isadora admitted. "But if they don't listen, and they still choose to fire on us, then the blood will be on their hands, not ours, and the whole world will see it." Later that night, long after the council had ended, she sat alone by her fire, staring into the flames. Wakasa approached slowly, a thick buffalo blanket draped over his arm. "You are shaking," he said. She hadn't even noticed. He wrapped the heavy blanket around her shoulders and sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "This is your war now, too," he said quietly. She continued to stare into the fire. "It always was," she whispered. "I just didn't know which side I was on." He studied her profile in the firelight, the way the flames danced in her eyes, the determined set of her jaw. "Why did you come with me today?" she asked, turning to look at him. "To meet them?" He didn't hesitate. "Because they needed to see you," he said. "They needed to see you stand between two worlds and choose." She turned back to the fire, her voice soft. "And which world do you think I chose?" He didn't touch her, but he leaned closer, so close that his breath was warm against her cheek. "This one," he said, "because it's the only one that's real." As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, she stood once again at the edge of the village, staring out into the vast, empty plains. She could already imagine the dust rising in the distance. The army would come, maybe in 3 days, maybe sooner. But this time, she wouldn't run. This time, she wouldn't hide. This time, she wouldn't kneel. "If they come looking for a fight," she whispered to the wind, "we'll answer with something they have never seen before. Mercy." The village moved like a quiet, well-oiled machine. There was no panic, no frantic fear, only a grim, focused determination. Before the first light of dawn, the children were sent north with the elders, a long, silent procession disappearing into the hills, hidden away in ancient caves and wooded valleys known only to the Lakota. The women packed food and medicine into sturdy leather sacks. The warriors sharpened their blades, not with the heat of bloodlust in their eyes, but with the cold weight of duty. This was not a preparation for slaughter. It was a preparation for history. Isadora stood beside Wakasa in the center of the camp as the final, most dangerous piece of their plan took shape. A message had already been sent. A trusted young scout named Mako, swift and silent as a hawk, was already a day into his 3-day ride east to Fort Randall. He carried a letter, carefully written by Isadora in her precise script, sealed with the wax stamp of her family's name, a name she hoped still carried some weight. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a request for a witness. If the army was going to strike an unarmed village, she wanted someone there to see it, not a general, not a politician, a journalist, someone with ink and paper whose words couldn't be silenced by gunpowder or rank. "They want to bury the truth with bodies," she had said to the council. "Then let's give the truth a heartbeat that is faster than their bullets." Now all they had to do was hold on. 3 days. Wakasa tightened the straps on his horse's saddle. "We won't last 3 hours if they charge the basin," he said, his voice low and grim. "I know," she replied, meeting his gaze, "but we're still doing this." He nodded. "We're still doing this." By noon on the second day, the wind shifted, and with it came the telltale sign they had been dreading. A brown dust cloud rising in the east. They were coming early, faster this time, not cautious, not diplomatic. They were coming ready for a fight. The cavalry stopped just out of rifle range, forming long, perfect lines, a wall of blue and steel. The sun glinted off their bayonets. Isadora recognized the insignia on the lead officer's shoulder. It wasn't Raphael. It was Colonel Merritt, a man with a notorious reputation for swift, brutal action and a taste for erasure. He raised a white cloth, a flag of parley, but it flapped in the wind like a dare, not a promise. Isadora and Wakasa rode out to meet him in the no-man's land between the two forces. Colonel Merritt did not dismount. He looked down at them from his tall horse, his face a mask of arrogant impatience. "You were given 3 days," he barked, his voice carrying easily in the tense silence. "It has only been 2, Isadora replied, her own voice calm and steady. "And yet here you are, eager to stain this earth with the blood of people who have not fired a single shot at you." "You are harboring fugitives," Merritt sneered. "You are obstructing federal law. We are protecting families, children, elders." Merritt's cold eyes narrowed. "You're the Herrera girl, aren't you?" She didn't flinch. "I was." He smiled, a thin, cruel slash across his face. "Treason wears many different faces, it seems." Wakasa urged his horse forward a step. "We ask for one thing," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Time." "You've had your time." "No," Isadora said, her voice cutting in, sharp and clear. "We ask for a witness, someone who is not paid by a uniform or by politicians. He is on his way." Merritt actually scoffed, a short, ugly sound of disbelief. "A journalist? You think a man with ink on his fingers is going to stop bullets?" "No," she said, "but his ink will remember where those bullets landed, and so will the world." Merritt's face darkened with fury. "You have until dawn," he spat. "At dawn, we move, with or without your witness." That night, the fires in the village burned low. There was no drumming, no laughter, just the heavy silence of waiting and watching. Isadora sat by a fire at the edge of the camp, sharpening a dull blade. Not because she thought she would need it, but because the repetitive, scraping sound of stone on steel kept her sane. Wakasa came and sat beside her. He held a small leather pouch in his hand. He opened it and poured 4 small, polished stones into his palm. Each was painted with a different symbol. "What are those?" she asked. "Prayer stones," he said. "For protection, for truth, for death, and for return." "Which one do you carry for yourself?" she asked. He turned one of the stones over in his palm. It was painted with a symbol that looked like a single, open eye. "The one for truth." She smiled, a small, sad smile. "Not the one for protection?" He shook his head, then picked up another stone, this one painted with a coiled snake, the symbol for death. He held it out to her. "This one is yours," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "You carry it," he explained, his voice soft, "so that the rest of us do not have to." The next morning the wind died, and with it died any lingering illusion that mercy was coming. At the first light of sunrise, the cavalry began to move. Lines formed, commands were shouted across the plain. Wakasa mounted his horse. He called the warriors of the village to their formation, not to charge, but to stand. They formed a single long line at the edge of the village, visible, human. There would be no ambush, no trap, just defiance, just presence. Isadora stood at the very center of their line. She was unarmed. She wore a simple dress, and over her shoulders she had draped a bright red shawl. She had braided her hair in the Lakota way. She no longer looked like someone caught between two worlds. She looked like someone who had chosen hers. Colonel Merritt raised his arm, ready to give the signal to charge. And then a new sound. A horn. But it wasn't theirs. It came from the west, from behind the village. A single rider, approaching at a breakneck pace, dust flying from his horse's hooves. "Mako!" someone shouted. The young scout rode hard and reckless, his horse foaming at the mouth. He nearly collapsed as he slid to a stop in front of Wakasa. He held up a folded piece of paper, crumpled and stained with sweat. Isadora snatched it from his hand. She saw the seal and her heart nearly stopped. The Chicago Tribune. She ripped it open. It was a short note. "Reporter dispatched. Will arrive at sunrise tomorrow." Too late. She looked at Wakasa, her eyes wide with desperation. "They'll come anyway," she whispered, "even knowing someone is watching." He nodded, his face grim. "Then we make sure what they see can never be denied." And then it happened. Colonel Merritt's arm chopped down. The drums of war began. The cavalry surged forward, a tidal wave of steel and thunder ready to crash down upon them. But the Lakota didn't move. They stood their ground. They didn't raise their rifles. They didn't run. And in the center of it all, Isadora raised her hand, not in surrender, but in witness. Her red shawl lifted in the wind like a single defiant flame. Just before the first line of cavalry crossed into rifle range, a single shot rang out. But it didn't come from the soldiers. And it didn't come from the warriors. It came from the west. A rifle crack, echoing like a warning from the sky itself. A second rider appeared on the ridge, waving something high in the air. A hat. And a press badge. The journalist. He had arrived a day early. And behind him were 2 other riders, civilian observers he must have picked up along the way. The cavalry charge hesitated. The front lines slowed, horses bumping into each other in confusion. Colonel Merritt's hand froze in midair. Confusion turned to chaos. The script had been broken. And in that one, single, suspended breath, war did not come. Not yet. Not this time. That night, Isadora stood by the fire, breathing in the smoky air of a story that had not ended in blood. Wakasa came to her side. "You held them," he said, his voice filled with a quiet awe. "We all did," she replied. "But they were looking at you." She shook her head. "They were looking at the truth," she said. He reached into his leather pouch and took out the fourth prayer stone, the one for return. He pressed it into her hand and closed her fingers around it. "We did not survive because we fought," he whispered. "We survived because you made them look." But dawn brought more than just relief. The journalist, a man named Samuel Bell, stayed, asking pointed questions that the army didn't want answered. Raphael returned, not as a soldier, but as a brother, caught between the blood in his veins and the new belief in his heart. And Isadora had to face the hardest truth of all. Peace isn't won in a single dramatic moment. It's defended, over and over again, even if it means breaking your own heart to do it. The morning after the standoff felt impossibly, beautifully still. Smoke curled from the cooking fires. Horses drank peacefully at the stream. Children, brought back from their hiding places in the hills, chased dogs through the dust, their laughter a sound that felt like a miracle. It could have been any other day, except now the world was watching. The journalist, Samuel Bell, stayed for a week. He was a quiet man with ink-stained fingers and eyes that missed nothing. He moved through the village not as an intruder, but as a listener. He scribbled constantly in a small leather notebook. He spoke with Elsie, with Wakasa, with the mothers of the children Isadora had rescued, with the young warriors, with boys too young to even carry rifles. He didn't just ask them about the war. He asked them about their lives. He asked them why they had stayed, why they hadn't run, why they hadn't fired that first shot, why they had been willing to stand still while a cavalry charge thundered toward them like a storm of steel. And each time, from every person he spoke to, he got the same simple answer: because she did. That afternoon, Raphael returned. He came alone this time and unarmed. His uniform was dusty and faded. He had no sword at his belt, no orders to deliver. He was just a man who had followed the sound of something he had never expected to hear on a battlefield: mercy. He found her by the sacred spring, on her knees, rinsing a bundle of herbs in the cold, clear water. For a long time he just stood there, watching her. Finally he spoke. "They said you had started a war," he said, his voice rough with emotion. She looked up at him over her shoulder. "They were wrong," she said. "I stopped one." He came and crouched down beside her. "Merritt's been recalled," he told her. "He overstepped his authority. The Tribune's first article, it made it all the way to Washington. People are talking, Issa. They're actually talking." She said nothing, just continued to wash the herbs. "You saved their lives," he added. "I didn't save everyone," she said quietly, thinking of Wakasa's sister. "But I didn't lose myself either." He nodded slowly, then pulled a folded, worn letter from inside his coat. She took it, her hands still wet, and unfolded it carefully. It was their mother's handwriting. There were only 3 short lines. "If you are safe, I pray you stay. If you are not, I pray you run. Either way, my daughter, I love you." Tears rose fast and uninvited, and she didn't try to stop them. They traced clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. Raphael stood up, his own eyes damp but steady. "I still don't understand your choice, Isadora," he said, "but I finally respect it." She met his gaze. "Then that's enough." He turned to leave but paused. "If you ever come back," she smiled, a real, genuine smile. "I already am back, Raphael." That night, the village held a quiet feast. There was no loud music, no celebratory dancing, just hands passing food, voices speaking in low, grateful tones, and the warmth of the fire. It was a feast of mourning for what nearly was, and a feast of gratitude for what wasn't. Elsie sat beside Isadora and passed her a clay cup filled with sweet, honeyed water. "Still breathing, are we?" Elsie muttered in her usual gruff manner. I guess the ancestors haven't had enough of our stubbornness yet. Isadora laughed softly. Or maybe they're just watching the show. Elsie leaned in close, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. Oh, they were watching. They were watching when you stood still and didn't flinch. You showed them something they haven't seen from one of your kind in a very long time. What's that? A different kind of warrior. Later, after the feast had ended, she walked alone to the edge of the ridge that overlooked the plains. The stars had begun to pierce the deep purple sky, sharp and clear and defiant. Wakasa joined her, his footsteps silent on the earth. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. She reached out and took his hand, and their fingers locked together as if they had been carved from the same piece of wood. I never thought I would belong anywhere, she said, her voice a whisper on the night air. Not truly. You don't belong here, he said softly. She looked at him, startled and hurt. He smiled faintly, a rare and beautiful thing. You are here, he clarified, and that has made all the difference. In the weeks and months that followed, the village rebuilt its fragile peace. The children returned for good, the settlers stayed away from the spring, and the army kept its distance. Samuel Bell's articles made headlines across the country. He called her the woman in red who stopped a war. But she didn't care about the ink. She cared about the hands in the village that no longer trembled at the sound of distant horses. She cared about the children who no longer hid when a stranger approached. One day the wind carried a story from another village, far to the south. A story of how they, too, had refused to flee, how they had stood silent and unarmed in the path of soldiers, and how they, too, had been spared. Her story was spreading, not just hers, theirs. A new way to fight was being born. Isadora kept the 4 prayer stones by her sleeping mat. She didn't always pray the way the Lakota did, but sometimes, in the quiet of the night, she would hold them in her palm, their polished surfaces smooth against her skin, and she would whisper something small and hopeful into the earth. Not for peace, not for forgiveness, but for understanding, for the strength to choose again tomorrow, to stand again tomorrow, to live a life where victory didn't mean winning. It meant surviving, together. And years from now, when people would ask how it all began, how the blood stopped boiling and the fires of war turned to warm embers, how mercy finally found a foothold on the edge of a brutal world, they would say it started with a girl in a red shawl, a girl who was sold as a peace offering, but who refused to be a sacrifice, a girl who walked into the heart of the storm and stayed. Some wars aren't fought with guns. They're fought by standing still long enough for the truth to be seen. What do you think? Was her courage a greater weapon than any rifle? If you were moved by Isadora's story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of unbelievable bravery and the hidden heroes of history.